There are seasons when God seems to vanish, when the people you relied on fade, doors close without reason, and silence becomes your only companion. In that darkness, you may wonder if you've done something wrong, if heaven has turned its face away. But the truth is far deeper. Isolation is not always punishment. Often, it is preparation. The Almighty does His greatest work in hidden places, caves, deserts, prisons, and nights of wrestling. He pulled Moses into the backside of the wilderness, David into the fields, Elijah into the cave, and Paul into Arabia. Each was removed before they were revealed. When God isolates you, He is not ignoring you, He is insulating you. He's cutting away the noise so you can hear His whisper. The loneliness you feel is not emptiness, it's sacred space being cleared for revelation. Do not despair when you are alone. You are not forgotten, you are being formed. God isolates not to break you down, but to rebuild you stronger, clearer, and anchored in His purpose. The hidden season is not a pause, it's the construction site of destiny. When God begins to isolate you, it can feel as though the world has turned its back on you. People who once walked closely beside you suddenly drift away. Opportunities that once came easily now seem to vanish. You look around and realize you've been separated from the familiar. The first impulse is to assume something has gone wrong, that perhaps you've taken a wrong turn or fallen out of favor. But in the divine economy, isolation is rarely accidental. It is a deliberate and sacred process orchestrated by the hand of God. He removes you not to harm you, but to prepare you. What feels like separation is often divine strategy. God cannot reveal the fullness of His plan in the midst of distraction. He has to get you alone to make you ready for what's next. Throughout Scripture, we find a pattern. Before elevation comes isolation. Joseph was separated from his family, betrayed, and imprisoned. Yet in the shadows of that isolation, God was refining His wisdom, teaching him stewardship, and cultivating character that could carry the weight of authority. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before his calling erupted in fire from a burning bush. David tended sheep in solitude long before a crown touched his head. Even Christ Himself withdrew to solitary places to commune with the Father. Each time, separation preceded revelation. Each time, isolation birthed clarity. God's method never changes. He hides before He highlights. When God isolates you, He is reordering your dependencies. He strips away the supports that once held you so you can learn to lean fully on Him. People may misunderstand you, opportunities may dry up, and the applause may stop. But that silence is divine. He is training you to hear His voice without interference. The solitude becomes a sacred classroom, a place where the noise of the world cannot compete with the whisper of heaven. When you're surrounded by people, it's easy to confuse their voices for His. But when God closes every door and draws you away, it's because He desires an unfiltered conversation with your soul. Many believers misinterpret this season as punishment, but isolation is the sign that God trusts you with intimacy. It means He is inviting you into the deeper chambers of His purpose. Think of it as the cocoon that transforms a caterpillar into a butterfly. Inside that tight, unseen space, a miraculous process unfolds. To anyone watching from the outside, it looks like death, but within that hidden enclosure, new wings are being formed. That is what happens when God isolates you. Your identity is being reshaped, your spirit renewed, your destiny reconstructed. What once defined you begins to fall away, and a new version of you is being birthed through the pressure of solitude. There are some revelations God cannot give you in a crowd. There are dimensions of His voice that cannot be heard amidst the chaos of company. So He draws you out, not to destroy you, but to reveal Himself. The Israelites experienced this when God led them into the wilderness. Away from Egypt, away from noise and distraction, He introduced Himself as their sustainer, provider, and guide. In isolation, they learned what it meant to depend not on Pharaoh, but on the manna that fell from heaven. It was in the wilderness that they discovered His presence by fire and cloud. The place they feared most became the place they knew Him best. When you find yourself isolated, don't fight to go back to what God is freeing you from. Sometimes He removes people not because they're evil, but because they can't go where you're going. Some environments can't sustain the new version of you that He's creating. Just as Abram had to leave his homeland before God could make him Abraham, you too must step out of the familiar to enter the promised. Isolation is the womb of transformation. It's where God takes your faith from borrowed belief to personal conviction. So when everything grows quiet and it feels like the world has forgotten you, don't despair. Heaven hasn't gone silent, it's drawing you closer. When the crowd disperses and the lights dim, that's when God begins to speak clearly. He's saying, "Now that I have you alone, I can show you who you really are." The purpose of isolation is revelation. It's a divine appointment where the maker meets the molded, where the potter works on the clay without interruption. Do not rush this season. Do not resent it. Lean into it with trust. God is doing in private what will later be seen in public. You may not understand it now, but when the appointed time comes, the reason for your isolation will shine like the dawn. What feels like separation today will tomorrow be recognized as preparation. God isolates His chosen not to punish them, but to perfect them, to strip away the temporary so they can carry the eternal. And when the time comes for you to emerge, you will realize that solitude was not a setback, but a setup for destiny. The wilderness is not a place of punishment, it is a place of preparation. When God draws a person into isolation, He is inviting them into His divine classroom, a setting stripped of distraction, noise, and applause, where the only voice that remains is His. The wilderness has always been God's chosen place for transformation. It is where the noise of life is silenced, and the soul is taught to listen. It is not comfortable, it is not glamorous, but it is holy ground. Every great servant of God must pass through it, for in the wilderness we are unmade before we are remade. The lessons learned there cannot be taught in comfort. They must be forged in silence, solitude, and surrender. In the wilderness, everything unnecessary begins to fall away. The Israelites had to wander there for 40 years before they could enter the promise. That journey wasn't wasted time. It was a process of purification. They had been delivered from Egypt, but Egypt still lived in them. Their habits, fears, and dependencies had to be stripped away before they could walk in freedom. God uses the wilderness to detox our souls from everything that competes for His place. He exposes false securities, confronts hidden idols, and reveals the weakness of our own strength. It is there that we learn that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. The wilderness is God's testing ground for trust. When you can no longer see the path ahead, when the resources run dry, when no one is around to applaud or affirm you, that is when faith becomes real. In that lonely classroom, God teaches reliance. He shows you that your survival does not depend on people, titles, or possessions, but on Him alone. The lesson is simple but profound. If God is all you have, then God is all you need. Those who have never walked through that kind of dependence cannot truly carry the authority of faith, for true authority is born out of absolute trust. Moses was trained in Egypt's finest institutions, but his real education began in the desert of Midian. For 40 years, he learned the ways of solitude, silence, and patience while tending sheep. When he had been emptied of his own ambition and pride, when the prince of Egypt had become the humble shepherd, then God called his name from the burning bush. The wilderness unlearned him, so God could relearn him. It took the desert to turn a man of might into a man of God. In the same way, our wilderness seasons strip away everything false, so that what remains is real faith, genuine humility, and a purified heart. Jesus Himself was led by the Spirit into the wilderness after His baptism. Notice, it was not the devil who led Him there, it was the Spirit. The wilderness was not a punishment, but an appointment. There, stripped of comfort and companionship, He faced temptation, hunger, and silence. But every test He passed in that barren place fortified His authority for the ministry ahead. Before He performed a miracle in public, He conquered temptation in private. The wilderness prepared Him to stand before men because He had already stood alone before God. So when God places you in your own wilderness, do not misread it as abandonment. It is not rejection, it is refinement. He is teaching you lessons that comfort could never teach. He is burning away impurities that success might conceal. He is preparing you for responsibilities you cannot yet carry. Every silence, every unanswered prayer, every delay is part of the curriculum. And though it feels lonely, heaven is not absent, it is observing. The wilderness is where God measures your obedience in the absence of visible reward. It is where your heart is proven genuine. When you finally emerge from that season, you will not come out the same. The noise of the world will no longer hold the same power over you. You will have learned how to discern his whisper in the wind, how to follow even when you cannot see. You will walk with a quiet authority, one that can only be birthed through solitude. The wilderness gives you spiritual muscles that cannot be built in comfort. It teaches endurance, patience, and unwavering faith. So, if you find yourself in a barren place where prayers seem unanswered and the path feels unclear, remember this: you are not lost, you are enrolled. You are sitting in the school of the Spirit, and the teacher is silent because the test is in progress. Trust that he has not abandoned you. He is forming you. Every dry place has a hidden spring. Every silence hides a lesson. Every wilderness leads to a promised land. God never wastes pain, and he never misuses isolation. The wilderness is his classroom, and when the lessons are complete, you will emerge refined, resilient, and ready to carry the glory he has prepared for you. Before every promotion, there is always a pruning. Before God can multiply your influence, he must first subtract your attachments. Before he can trust you with more, he must remove what keeps you tied to less. Pruning is not punishment, it is divine precision. It is God's loving hand cutting away what will not bear fruit in the next season of your life. It feels painful because he's trimming parts of your heart you thought you needed: relationships, habits, ambitions, comforts. But every cut carries intention. The gardener never cuts to destroy, he cuts to make room for abundance. When you feel things being stripped away, understand that heaven is shaping you for power. God prunes before he promotes. We often pray for elevation without realizing that pruning is the path to it. You cannot walk in divine authority with a divided heart. You cannot carry a fresh anointing with stale attachments. God must remove the excess weight that would collapse your foundation under pressure. Jesus said, "Every branch that bears fruit he prunes, that it may bear more fruit." Notice, he doesn't prune the barren branch, he prunes the fruitful one. That means your pain is proof of productivity. The very fact that you're being cut back means God sees fruit in you worth refining. The pruning process is evidence that you're not forgotten, you're chosen for more. When God begins to prune, it can feel like loss. People may walk away, opportunities may disappear, and plans you carefully built may crumble overnight. You might wonder if something went wrong, but this is where faith must mature. Sometimes God has to disappoint your plans to deliver his purpose. He removes certain people not because they're evil, but because they can't carry the weight of your calling. He closes doors not because you're unqualified, but because what's behind them would dilute your destiny. The pruning knife is sharp, but it's held by a loving hand. Every time something leaves, something greater is being prepared. Look at Joseph. Before he ever sat on Pharaoh's throne, God stripped him of his coat of many colors. That coat represented his father's favor and his family identity, but it could not go with him into the palace. God had to remove what was familiar to prepare him for what was foreign. The pit, the prison, and the false accusations were all pruning stages. Each cut brought him closer to the core of his purpose. What others meant for evil, God used for refining. When the time came for promotion, Joseph could carry it with humility because he had already been emptied of pride through pain. David's journey tells the same story. Before he became king, God pruned him of Saul's approval, public applause, and the comfort of position. He was anointed long before he was appointed. In between, he endured years of rejection and exile. Those years were not wasted. They were the shears of God shaping his heart to rule with compassion and dependence on him. Had David gone straight from the pasture to the palace, he might have ruled like Saul, insecure and self-serving. But the pruning gave him perspective. It taught him to find strength not in a throne, but in the presence of God. Pruning is God's mercy in disguise. It prevents you from carrying into your future the things that would sabotage your destiny. It refines your motives, clarifies your vision, and deepens your roots. When branches are cut, the energy that once flowed to maintain them is redirected toward growth. Likewise, when God removes distractions, your spiritual focus increases. Your prayers become sharper, your worship becomes deeper, and your discernment grows stronger. The pain of pruning produces purity of purpose. Do not resist the pruning season. Do not rush to replace what God removes. Trust his shears. When something falls away, say, "Lord, I trust your wisdom." The branches that fall are not your loss, they are his love. Every severed tie is a step closer to divine alignment. The discomfort you feel is not evidence of abandonment. It's the sign that God is near, working carefully, trimming strategically. When the pruning is complete, you will bear fruit you never imagined. You will look back and realize that every loss was gain in disguise. The things you thought you couldn't live without were only holding you back from who you were meant to become. God prunes before He empowers, because He wants your roots to be stronger than your reach. Power without pruning leads to pride, but pruning births purity, and purity is what sustains power. So when you find yourself in a season of reduction, do not despair. The knife in His hand is not a weapon, it's a tool of transformation. What feels like breaking is really building. The gardener knows exactly where to cut, and when he's finished, your life will bear a harvest that proves every wound was worth it. God often hides those He intends to use greatly. Before He reveals a person to the world, He conceals them in the shadows. Hiddenness is not rejection, it is protection. It is the sacred space where destiny is matured in silence. Every instrument of God has passed through this secret process. When you are hidden, it feels as though your efforts go unnoticed, your prayers unheard, your potential unseen. But God's greatest works are formed away from the spotlight. Just as seeds grow in the soil before they break through the surface, so too your calling is cultivated beneath the ground of obscurity. He hides you so you can be developed, not destroyed by early exposure. The human heart often longs for recognition, to be seen, to be validated. Yet God knows that visibility too soon can corrupt what is still fragile. He protects you from premature promotion because He understands what you don't. Untested character cannot carry divine weight. When God hides you, He is building within you the structure necessary to sustain your future assignment. He refines your motives, strengthens your discernment, and purifies your desires until what you want aligns fully with His will. Hiddenness is God's workshop, where He replaces self-reliance with dependence on Him. Think of David after his anointing. The prophet Samuel poured oil on his head and declared that he would be king, but instead of a throne, David found himself back in the fields with sheep. He was hidden, not forgotten. God was shaping his heart in solitude. The same hands that fought lions and bears would one day wield a scepter, but first they needed to be trained in secrecy. Those lonely pastures became his classroom for leadership, worship, and warfare. When no one saw him, God did. When no one celebrated him, heaven was recording every faithful act. Hiddenness was the cocoon where David's kingship was being formed. Look also at Joseph. Before he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, he spent years in obscurity in Potiphar's house, then in a prison cell. Forgotten by men, remembered by God. Every unseen moment was preparation for visibility. Had Joseph been released earlier, his wisdom would not have been complete, his humility not yet mature. God used confinement to forge character. The darkness of that cell was not absence, but incubation. When the appointed time came, Joseph emerged ready, steady, and full of divine insight. Even Jesus lived in hiddenness for 30 years before 3 years of ministry. Think of that ratio, 3 decades of preparation for 3 years of manifestation. The Son of God, the Word made flesh, chose silence over spotlight until the appointed hour. His miracles were not delayed by lack of ability. They were restrained by obedience to divine timing. If Jesus Himself embraced hiddenness, who are we to despise it? The waiting season is not wasted time. It is sanctified time. God is not ignoring you. He is investing in you. When God hides you, He is shielding you from distractions that could derail your purpose. You may feel overlooked, but He is actually overshadowing you. The same cloud that concealed Israel by day also protected them from the scorching heat. In the same way, His covering may limit your visibility, but it guards your growth. The people around you may not see what God is doing, but heaven knows exactly what stage of development you're in. He is cultivating roots that go deep before allowing branches to stretch wide. Hiddenness also teaches humility. It removes the need to perform for approval and grounds you in identity rather than applause. When no one praises your efforts, you learn to serve for His glory alone. When no one notices your sacrifices, you realize He is the only audience that matters. This purifies your intentions so that when visibility comes, you won't be corrupted by it. Many crave to be seen, but few are willing to be hidden. Yet it is only the hidden who are truly prepared to be revealed. So if you find yourself unseen, unknown, or overlooked, do not lose heart. You are not behind. You are being built. The hidden season is sacred ground where destiny matures quietly. Every prayer, every tear, every unseen act of faithfulness is shaping the person you must become. When the time is right, God will uncover what He has cultivated. He will open doors that no man can shut, and when He does, you will carry a strength, depth, and humility that can only come from being hidden. Do not fight to be seen before your season. Stay faithful in obscurity. The God who hid you will reveal you when your preparation has met His perfect timing. Until then, rest in the shadows of His wisdom, for in the hidden place you are being shaped for glory. There are moments when God's silence feels deafening, when every prayer seems to vanish into the heavens without an echo, and when guidance feels out of reach. In those moments, the human heart is tempted to believe that God has withdrawn, or that we have somehow drifted beyond His care. Yet this silence is often not absence, but strategy. God speaks in many ways, and when His audible voice grows quiet, His hand begins to move in ways that words could never convey. Spiritual discernment is not the ability to hear more, it's the ability to perceive deeper. It is recognizing that even in the stillness, God is orchestrating events, aligning circumstances, and shaping your inner world. When He seems silent, He is not ignoring you, He is inviting you to listen differently. God's silence is a sacred invitation to mature. When we first come to faith, we depend on emotional reassurance, the tangible signs, the immediate answers. But as we grow, God weans us off spiritual dependency and calls us into spiritual discernment. He teaches us to trust, not because we feel Him, but because we know Him. This is where many falter, mistaking quietness for distance. Yet the silence of God is often the highest form of communication. It's how He teaches trust beyond emotion, faith beyond evidence, obedience beyond comfort. Think of Job. In his suffering, the heavens seemed closed. His prayers returned unanswered, his questions met with stillness. Yet behind that silence, God was writing one of the most powerful testimonies of faith the world has ever known. Job's understanding of God deepened not through explanations, but through endurance. When God finally spoke, it was not to justify the silence, but to reveal His sovereignty. Job discovered that silence had been the incubator of revelation. In quiet seasons, God is not punishing you. He is maturing you for understanding that can only be gained through stillness. Jesus Himself experienced divine silence. In Gethsemane, He prayed until His sweat became like drops of blood, yet heaven did not answer as He might have hoped. On the cross He cried, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And still the Father remained silent. But that silence was not neglect. It was the unfolding of redemption. In heaven's stillness, the greatest victory was being achieved. When God is silent, it is not because He is absent, it is because He is accomplishing something so profound that words cannot explain it in the moment. We must learn to interpret silence through the lens of sovereignty, not fear. When you don't hear Him, watch what He's doing. When He doesn't speak, observe how He's moving. He may be aligning people, rearranging timing, or preparing you for an answer greater than your request. Often, God's silence is protection. If He spoke too soon, you might act prematurely. If He revealed too much, you might rely on knowledge instead of faith. His silence disciplines your spirit to wait, to trust, to yield. In that waiting, discernment is sharpened, and your spiritual senses become attuned to the subtler frequencies of His presence. Many of the greatest transformations in Scripture happened in quiet places. Elijah fled into the wilderness and waited for God's voice. He experienced the wind, the earthquake, and the fire, but God was in none of them. Then came a still, small voice. The voice was always there, but Elijah had to be still enough to hear it. God often whispers because He wants you close. Silence draws you nearer, strips away noise, and reorders your focus. It teaches you to listen with your heart instead of your ears. Discernment grows strongest when sight and sound are limited. Just as physical darkness enhances the other senses, spiritual silence awakens awareness. In seasons where God seems silent, He's calling you to perceive the unseen, to notice the patterns, to sense His presence in the ordinary, to discern His leading through peace rather than sound. When you no longer depend on noise to confirm His nearness, you begin to walk by faith and not by sight. That's maturity. That's spiritual growth. So, do not despair when heaven grows quiet. Stillness is a sacred conversation in progress. God's silence is often His way of saying, stay close, keep trusting, I am working. Let the silence refine your sensitivity rather than erode your confidence. When words stop, watch for movement. When prayers seem unanswered, trust that the answer is forming behind the curtain. The silence is not rejection. It's preparation for revelation. And when God finally speaks again, His voice will not only answer your question, it will redefine your understanding. Silence is never empty for the one who knows how to listen. It is the language of God's deepest work, the place where faith stops hearing and starts knowing. When God separates you, it can feel like a tearing, a pulling away from people, places, and patterns that once felt like home. You may not understand why certain relationships end, why familiar environments grow uncomfortable, or why doors that once opened easily now stay shut. But separation is one of God's oldest and most intentional methods of shaping a soul. He separates to sanctify. He withdraws to refine. He removes you from what was so He can reveal what will be. It's not rejection, it's recalibration. Separation is never random. Every shift, every departure, every closed chapter is an act of divine alignment, setting you apart for a higher purpose that cannot flourish in old soil. Throughout Scripture, separation precedes elevation. God told Abraham to leave his country, his kindred, and his father's house before He would show him the promised land. The journey of faith began with a breakaway. Abraham could not discover his destiny while clinging to his comfort zone. God often gives us vision, but withholds location until obedience is tested. Separation reveals what we truly trust, our surroundings or our shepherd. When He says, "Come out," it's not to leave us wandering, but to lead us into something new, something designed exclusively for who we are becoming. Separation exposes attachments that compete with God's will. Some relationships are seasonal, designed to carry you only part of the way. When their purpose is complete, God allows them to fade. Trying to hold on past their season creates stagnation. The same people who celebrated your past may not understand your future, and that's okay. Divine separation is not always about conflict, it's often about calling. When God calls you higher, not everyone can go with you. The climb gets steeper and the crowd gets thinner. Jesus Himself experienced this. When He prepared to reveal the fullness of His mission, He left the multitudes and took only Peter, James, and John to the mountaintop. Even among the 12, only a few could handle the revelation of glory. Separation is the sieve through which God filters your circle, ensuring that what remains is aligned with your destiny. Separation also recalibrates your heart. It exposes hidden dependencies. How much of your confidence is anchored in approval, recognition, or human connection? When God removes those supports, He is teaching you to stand on Him alone. It can feel lonely, but that loneliness becomes holy ground. In that space, you begin to rediscover who you are apart from what others expect. The noise of the crowd fades, and suddenly you can hear God's whisper more clearly. Separation creates space for clarity. It removes the clutter of comparison and the distraction of competing voices so that your inner compass can point true north again. The process of separation often feels painful because it confronts our need for control. We like to choose what leaves and what stays, but God doesn't always ask for permission. He moves according to purpose. The friends who distance themselves, the opportunities that vanish, the doors that lock, these are not accidents. They are orchestration. God is pruning your connections so you can grow in purity. He is severing ties that would sabotage your next level. And though it may sting in the moment, the fruit of obedience will outweigh the pain of detachment. Think of Elijah by the brook Cherith. God told him to hide there, separated from everyone, sustained only by ravens and a drying stream. When the brook finally dried up, Elijah could have panicked, but it was God's signal to move. Separation from one provision prepared him for the next. Each isolation was a redirection. What looks like loss is often transition, a divine hand steering you into the next chapter. If Elijah had clung to the brook, he would have missed the widow in Zarephath and the miracle waiting there. So too, when God removes one source, it's not to deprive you, but to develop you. Separation isn't about distance, it's about direction. God separates not to scatter, but to send. Every divine disconnection carries purpose. The moment you stop mourning what left and start trusting who remains, peace returns. You'll begin to see that separation was never about abandonment. It was an answer to prayer you didn't know you prayed. You asked God to grow you, to use you, to take you higher. This is how He does it. So when God separates you, don't run back to what He's releasing. Don't fight to keep what His hand is removing. Let Him reposition you. The space He's creating is sacred. It's meant to be filled with His presence and purpose. You may feel alone, but you're not abandoned. You're being aligned. Separation is not a curse, but a calling. Not a loss, but an invitation. When the dust settles, you'll see that every exit made room for entrance, every goodbye prepared you for new beginnings, and every separation was simply God clearing the path for your destiny to unfold in divine order. Despair is one of the enemy's most subtle weapons. It creeps in when silence lingers too long, when promises seem delayed, and when isolation feels unending. It whispers that God has forgotten, that purpose has passed, that all your waiting has been wasted. But despair is always a lie, because God never wastes a season, and He never forgets His own. Every tear, every unanswered prayer, every lonely night is accounted for. The same God who allowed you to be isolated is the one who will bring you out in power. What looks like abandonment is often divine alignment. He is not pushing you away. He is positioning you for something greater than your understanding can yet comprehend. Despair thrives in misunderstanding. It takes what is temporary and paints it as final. But the believer must remember that God's processes always look like endings before they reveal beginnings. Joseph in the pit, Moses in the wilderness, David in exile, Paul in prison, each of them could have believed they were finished. Yet, in those moments of isolation, purpose was quietly unfolding. The pit became the pathway to the palace. The wilderness became the meeting place of fire and calling. The prison became the pulpit of revelation. God does not abandon His chosen. He refines them in silence so that their emergence carries eternal weight. When you feel despair pressing in, it's a sign that breakthrough is near. The darkness always deepens before the dawn. The enemy attacks hardest when heaven is about to move. He wants to convince you to quit before the shift occurs. But faith that survives despair is faith that reigns in destiny. When you choose to believe in God's goodness even when nothing makes sense, you disarm the power of the enemy. Despair feeds on doubt, but it starves in the presence of trust. That's why your greatest weapon in isolation is worship, not the kind born of emotion, but the kind forged in faith. When you can lift your hands and say, "Lord, I still trust you," even in pain, heaven moves. God never promised that the journey would be easy, but He did promise that it would be worth it. The road to purpose is paved with waiting, pruning, and sometimes deep loneliness, but these are the birth pangs of destiny. Despair tells you it's over, but heaven says, "Hold on, I'm not done." The moment you feel like you have nothing left to give is often the moment just before God breathes fresh strength into your spirit. He specializes in resurrection, and resurrection only happens where something seems dead. If it feels like your dreams, your hope, or your faith have died, remember, you serve a God who speaks life into tombs. What feels final is simply the soil for something new. Despair blinds you to purpose, but purpose restores vision. That's why you must choose to see beyond your emotions. Every trial has an assignment, every delay carries a lesson, every disappointment hides direction. God is weaving something intricate in the unseen. He's aligning the right people, orchestrating the right moments, and maturing your character so you can carry what you prayed for. If He gave it to you too soon, it would crush you. That's why He delays. Not to deny you, but to develop you. And when the timing is right, what once broke your heart will make sense. You'll see that the isolation was not a sentence, it was a strategy. When Elijah sat beneath the broom tree and begged to die, believing his purpose was over, God didn't rebuke him. He fed him, He restored him. Then He whispered, "You are not done." The same God who met Elijah in despair will meet you in yours. He will remind you that you are not finished, not forgotten, not forsaken. Despair may visit, but it cannot stay. You are being strengthened, not shattered, refined, not rejected. So lift your eyes again. Refuse to let despair dictate the narrative of your faith. God is nearer in your loneliness than you realize. His silence is not distance, it's depth. He's teaching you to trust His heart when you cannot trace His hand. Despair says you are abandoned. Truth says you are appointed. Despair says it's over. Faith says it's beginning. Hold your peace and stay in the process. Soon, the purpose of your pain will unfold, and when it does, you'll see that the very season that tried to break you became the womb that birthed your destiny. What felt like isolation was divine preparation, and what felt like despair was only the shadow of glory not yet revealed.